Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of, the Remnant podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. We've had a pretty good run lately, not necessarily consecutive, but a pretty good run of AEI colleagues on here of late, and we figured we'd really press our luck. Try to like help regress to the mean of quality as gently as possible. And so we have the director of the economic shop at the American Enterprise. I'm sure it's got some fancier title than that. Edmund Burke warned about how the age of wholesomeness had ended and had been replaced by the age of sophisters, economists, and calculators. And we figure that they need representation on this podcast as well. So, Michael Strain, welcome back to the Remnant. I'm sure you're like Matthew McConaughey in a hammock drinking a beer on the beach these days, right? Because everything's just going great. The winning is nonstop.
I'm really enjoying the winning, and yeah, time to close up shop. We've done all we can.
All right, so you don't need to go full Scott Lincecum on all of this, but in importance and relevance in the grand scheme of things, if you're at a family reunion and your cousin says, "Okay, so how big a deal is this tariff stuff?" What is your general answer to that?
I think it's a pretty big deal. I mean, maybe answer this in a few different ways. A lot of people are going to want to know what's this going to do to economic growth, and there's a lot of concern that the U.S. could enter a recession in the year 2025. I'm quite skeptical that will end up happening. I think it's a little bit difficult to even have conversations about what the impact of the tariffs are, of course, because we don't really know what the tariff policy is, and it seems to change from day to day. So, we're recording this conversation on March 11th. On March 11th, I'm not all that concerned about the economy entering into a recession. But I do think that that's the wrong bar. If we shouldn't have the standard be if the economy is shrinking, then things are bad. If the economy is growing, then things are good. We should want solid, robust economic growth, and there's a lot of room between solid, robust economic growth and a recession. So, I'm expecting that these tariffs will, shave quite a bit off of GDP growth in 2025. I think we will still grow in 2025, but just not as much as we otherwise would. I think
so Goldman just downgraded from like a 2.3 kind of prediction to a 1.6 or 1.7 or something like that.
Yeah, something like that. I think that's right. I think that's right in the ballpark. Maybe shave half a percentage point off GDP growth for the year, maybe a full percentage point off GDP growth for the year. And so that's a lot. I mean, that's, roughly speaking, cutting the growth rate by a quarter, cutting the growth rate in half. And that represents a lot of people who are going to be unemployed or underemployed who otherwise wouldn't be. It means that households are going to have less income than they otherwise would. It means that businesses are going to expand less than they otherwise would. Productivity will be slower than it otherwise would have been. And this is not good. And so that's kind of one answer to your question. I think another answer to your question is that this is really bad because of what it says about this administration. I mean, this is a policy with no upside. Mm-hmm. No one is winning. U.S. manufacturing companies are going to lose as a whole. U.S. workers are going to lose as a whole. U.S. households are going to lose as a whole. Who's who's winning here? This is a massive self-inflicted wound that is driven by a quasi-religious belief in the way that the global economy works and the way that trade policy works. And this is the kind of thing that in a democracy isn't supposed to happen. There's supposed to be competing pressures that get the president to not do something like this. And that is what we saw in the first term. I don't think President Trump's views on the way the global economy works or his views on trade policy have changed since the first term. What has changed is that there were competing pressures that stopped him from going into an all-out tit-for-tat trade war with Canada, going into an all-out tit-for-tat trade war with the European Union. And so that, I think, is very troubling. That he's not receiving pushback. Now, I do think that if things get bad enough, that pushback will materialize. But we shouldn't have to put our hand on the hot stove and leave it there while our hand is burning for months before we take our hand off. That shouldn't be the way our system works. Somebody should be grabbing the hand on the way to the hot stove and stopping it from touching the stove.
So, I looked it up recently. About 25% of our economy is based on international trade, something like that. So, even if the worst case scenario, if the trade policies shave 10% off of that, that's still it's not the catastrophe that people make it out to be. That doesn't mean I agree with you. It doesn't mean it's good policy, but it does seem like there's a third factor to it, which is like the multiplier effect of just the general uncertainty. I have friends who work in the business side of Washington, not local business, but not lobbying either, but like big. There's a lot of big business has to do with aerospace and connection to government contracts and all that kind of stuff. And the general sense from my friends is that everyone's just canceling any plans. They're just not doing anything new, right? Mm-hmm. Same thing at NIH, right? They're just not giving grants to anything, right? So it seems to me the tariff thing fits into a larger narrative that is taking hold in the business community that is just that we don't know what Trump is going to do, so let's hold off on doing X or Y, except for maybe bringing some supply chain stuff home because we know that's what we're supposed to be doing. But other than that, and that, what I find sort of funny about all this is like I hear the uncertainty argument made by a lot of left-wing people today, and I welcome it because I think it's correct. What is funny is like I'm old enough to remember 10 years ago, conservatives made this argument about Obama and uncertainty, and people like Jonathan Chait and others just mock the hell out of conservatives. This is a myth. This idea that businesses need certainty for all this, that's just not true, all that kind of stuff. And that's sort of just gotten memory hold. But it seems to me like in your own finance, I know analogies to personal finance are fraught when it comes to macroeconomics, but I think this one holds up, which is that if you're not sure whether your income is going to go down 5 to 50% next year, you don't make decisions that even you could afford if it only went down 5% because you just don't know, right? Yeah. So that doubt, that uncertainty thing, I think is a much bigger headwind than people are making it seem to be.
I think that's exactly right. And to comment on your memory hole point, briefly first, I think that's also exactly right. When I think back about the Obama years, I do think that there were some conservative commentators that exaggerated the importance of uncertainty. But I think not knowing what your compensation costs were going to be because you weren't sure how this new healthcare plan would work during the Obama years, that did slow down economic growth. And I think it slowed down hiring, and I think we have good evidence to support that view. And that happened in the context of a weak economy. And I think the kind of broader critique, of which this was one part, that President Obama should have been focusing on the labor market recovery from the financial crisis and focusing on economic growth following the financial crisis, and not focusing on expanding the healthcare safety net, I think was correct. It's also true, of course, as you say, that right now businesses are having a real hard time making plans, and this should be fairly intuitive. I mean, if you're a business and you use steel or aluminum, uh, to make your products, you have no real idea what that's going to cost. And it's not, like a few percentage points one way or the other. It's, is this going to be what I paid last year? Is it going to be 25% more than what I paid last year? Is it going to be 35% more? Is it going to be 10% more? And that makes it very hard for you to plan. And I think what we're seeing, not really in the data yet, but what we're seeing anecdotally, and I think what we know from previous episodes in the past, is that when businesses are faced with this level of uncertainty, they just kind of hold off. I'm not gonna make any plans that could be upended by a big change in the costs that I'm facing. Let's just kind of stand pat, wait for this situation to resolve, and then we can move forward. The president was asked about this over the weekend, and I think the question was the right question. Businesses can make plans. If we're going to have a tariff rate of 25% or whatever it is, just like tell businesses that, and then let them plan around it. And the president doesn't even want to do that. And I think part of what we're seeing is a reaction to the tariffs, but an important nuance there is that part of what we're seeing is also a reaction to the fact that the tariffs are on Monday, and then the tariffs on some goods are off on Tuesday, and then the tariffs on more goods are off on Wednesday, and then the tariffs on all goods are off on Thursday, but then maybe they're going to come back again in 2 weeks, and this just makes it completely impossible for businesses to make plans. You're starting to see anecdotes pile up that businesses are not only freezing their investment spending, but they're also cutting back on other expenditures. They're not going to expand headcount until all this gets resolved. They're trying to curtail travel expenses. They're telling their employees not to take trips until all this uncertainty gets resolved. And this is a real problem. I expect that businesses aren't going to really increase their investment spending in the first quarter relative to a year ago, probably not in the second quarter relative to a year ago. If this stuff continues, we might see business investment spending actually drag down overall economic growth for the year. And that's a big problem. That's a big problem for workers. It's a big problem for households. And that's all about businesses. I mean, our economy is powered by consumers. It's not powered by businesses, and nothing that I just said really directly addresses the problems that this policy creates for consumers, which is stuff is more expensive, the purchasing power of their wages and incomes are lower, their confidence is kind of in the tank, and that's the real nightmare scenario, is if consumers really start to pull back. And that's where recession scenarios start to become more plausible.
So, in fairness to the administration and to its supporters, Trump has said there's going to be a little disturbance. That Trump has said that that we need a transition because we're doing something really big. I think that's near exact quote. And so you said earlier that there's no upside to this. It's just a self-inflicted groin punch, or words to that effect. Now, the thing is, let's give them the benefit of the doubt and say, even though a 30-day reprieve to the auto industry is really no reprieve at all, because it's not like you can move an auto parts plant from Mexico to the United States in 30 days. I mean, I don't know that for a fact.
Oh, I do.
But I'm very willing to bet that way, right? My only point is I don't know how to build auto plants or dismantle them in foreign countries and move them across the border.
Doesn't take a month.
Yeah, I would assume it takes a considerably longer period than a month, and to do it well, maybe even much longer.
Yes.
And but let's give them the benefit of the doubt and say that this transition period is necessary. What is your response to the argument that once we get through the turmoil, Mrs. Lincoln, that things won't get much, that it won't be worth it? Like, bring all these things home, make everything in America again. Like, that sounds intuitive. I have my answers to this question, but I think it's something that people don't want to hear my answers. They want to hear your answers on. Intuitively, there are a lot of people, right? I mean, like when J.D. Vance said a million cheap toasters isn't worth one American job or something like that, there are a lot of people who said, hell yeah, buy American, right? And there's something that tickles our lizard brain or our emotional sweet tooth about this kind of thinking that says, yeah, we should make everything here. Autarky sounds awesome.
Yeah.
What is your sort of, for the layman, response or explanation about why that's a little off base or entirely off base?
Well, North Korea has tried really hard to be self-sufficient, and I don't think anybody would really want to move from the United States to North Korea, or even move from South Korea to North Korea.
You wouldn't want to move from Chad to North Korea.
And that's kind of a flip response, but I do think it's helpful to really think about, the implications for what this means, and is this what we want? Maybe another way to think about it is to kind of appeal to your daily life. I run a massive trade deficit with my grocery store. I'm constantly importing goods from the grocery store, and I'm not exporting any goods I produce to the grocery store. That's not a bad state of affairs. I think another kind of intuitive appeal, if you think about your daily life, is that we all practice comparative advantage in our lives. My comparative advantage is doing research and writing and doing things like this. This is what I do all day with my professional activities. I don't carve out a little bit of time to make my own clothing. I don't carve out a little bit of time to build my own car. I don't carve out a little bit of time to make my own shoes. I don't carve out a little bit of time to make the bread that my family will eat for breakfast. I let other people do that, and I specialize in what I'm good at. And that kind of basic logic of comparative advantage and the gains from specialization also applies to nations. There are other answers to this, I think. One is just the practicalities of this, which you mentioned earlier. It takes about a year to build a car plant. If you want to, relocate all of our automobile production from Canada and Mexico into the United States, that's a many-year project. If like it's even possible at all, it could take a decade. And so there's a real kind of practical argument to this. Like, is this actually an achievable goal? I think we can critique the desirability of the goal. The average service sector worker earns a higher wage than the average manufacturing worker. I understand that manufacturing jobs have a lot of political salience in swing states and presidential elections, and so therefore kind of become, a big part of our national conversation. But as the swing states gradually relocate, concern about this is gonna evaporate pretty quickly, and that's because of the underlying reality that service sector jobs pay more. Service sector jobs are more pleasant jobs than manufacturing or mining or something like this. They're safer jobs. than manufacturing or mining. Um, at the end of the day, if the goal is to make everything here, to revive domestic manufacturing, to roll back the clock a few decades in the labor market, what that means is that your goal is to give Americans worse jobs than they currently have, give Americans jobs that pay less than the jobs they currently have pay, to reduce the standard of living that households enjoy uh, relative to what it is today. And so these are just kind of silly goals in my judgment, and I think that this is a little bit of what spooked me, though, about what President Trump said over the weekend, and I think it's partly what spooked markets yesterday. Again, we're recording this on Tuesday, March 11th, and on Monday, March 10th, there was a big drop in the stock market. President Trump sounded like Steve Bannon
Mhm.
yesterday. I'm sorry, over the weekend. He sounded like J.D. Vance over the weekend. President Trump is a mercantilist. He believes that if the U.S. is running a bilateral trade deficit with another country, we are somehow losing. We're getting a bad deal. We're taking more from them than we're selling to them. That's not the way good business works. The president is wrong about those views. Um, those views are somewhat intuitive, but they're just analytically incorrect. Uh, but the way the president always talks about uh, his vision for trade policy and his vision for the global economy is that it will make America more prosperous. This is his kind of standard approach to this. We're getting ripped off. We're getting a raw deal, and what I'm going to do is make Americans richer, and I'm going to make Americans more prosperous. I'm going to get a better deal for this country. That's not how he sounded over the weekend. Over the weekend, he talked about the globalists who have been, ripping off American workers. He talked about how success can't be measured on a kind of quarter to quarter basis. And look at China; they have 100-year time horizon. We need to be more like that. And that is, that struck me as a different message from the president. And it suggested to me that he's interested in the kind of transformational change that would really set the country back. That it sounded much more to me like Steve Bannon or J.D. Vance. It sounded much less to me, like Larry Kudlow or Steve Mnuchin. And I thought that was troubling. Now, maybe the president got off the phone with Steve Bannon and then walked into the interview room and was just kind of responding to the questions. I hope that's the case. But I think certainly what freaked me out yesterday and what apparently freaked investors out was I don't think just that the president's committed to trying to push tariffs as high as they can go, but more so that the president isn't going to let like a bad economy in 2025, in the first quarter, in the second quarter, in the third quarter, deter him, and that he's maybe buying into some of this kind of, in my judgment, um, very damaging views that the U.S. has been pursuing an economic policy designed to uh, increase prosperity, and that has somehow been the wrong goal, and we need to pursue a different goal, a more fuzzy vision of national strength. And even if that means that we're much poorer and less prosperous as a consequence, that's actually like a feature, not a bug.
So, here's where I think the markets and a lot of that. I mean, I generally agree with that. Um, but my problem is I think economists tend to look at Trump's economic policies as distinct from the broader suite of his policies or his philosophical approach. I mean, I use philosophical very advisedly. But I think someone has gotten in his head, right? So, like, I remember I said on CNN once that if I were the White House chief of staff, I would have an absolute ban on all historians coming into the White House when Biden was president, right?
Mhm.
Because basically John Meacham and a couple other of these historians basically convinced him that the country was ready for him to do a New Deal.
Totally.
And that was that in Afghanistan were basically the undoing of the Biden presidency. Oh, and the fact that he was, a very old man. And I think something similar has happened with Trump, where whether it's Bannon or whoever has gotten in his head that your legacy is to be the new McKinley. He keeps bringing up McKinley, keeps bringing up Manifest Destiny.
Mm-hmm.
He talks about territorial expansion as a hallmark of American greatness, which is a very 19th century understanding of where greatness comes from, but it's in his head.
Mm-hmm.
And I think combined that with another thing he's similar with Biden on is that, and I guess this just happens with old men. Old men were told they were wrong when they were younger, and they can't let it go.
Mm-hmm.
And they have to prove they were right. So Trump has been saying that trade deficits, bilateral trade deficits are destroying America, right? His arguments about China are basically cut and paste from his arguments about Japan 40 years ago.
Yep.
And so it's this combination of I'm going to prove everybody I was right and wanting to be on Mount Rushmore in effect, that I think he thinks transforming America to a tariff-run economy, which he thinks would work, right? I mean, he literally thinks that you can get rid of the IRS and the income tax and replace it with tariffs, that it would work. But what he really wants to do is say, I was right. Sort of like the same way Biden wanted to say, I was right about getting out of Afghanistan, and so I'm just going to go ahead and do it. He's going to say, I've been right about tariffs all this time. I'm going to go ahead and do it. I was also right about all this law stuff, so I'm going to go after all my enemies there, blah, 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 blah. And I think that the people who want to argue, I totally get wanting to argue with the tariff stuff as if it's an economic argument. But I just don't think that that's the core way Trump sees it. Trump sees it much more as a zero-sum understanding from, being a condo salesman. And I think, symbolically, the real tell here is that you have Kevin Hassett, who used to be a colleague of ours at the American Enterprise Institute, Peter Navarro, the chief trade advisor, and what's his name, Tom Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary, all insisting that the current round of tariffs against Mexico and Canada are necessary because of the fentanyl trade, not for any economic reason. And when your best argument from your top economic spokespeople is about in Kevin's words, a drug war, and I kind of recall Kevin being pretty libertarian and saying drug wars are bad, but put that aside. I also kind of recall him being kind of free trade, but put that aside. That this has nothing to do with economics and trade and everything to do with fentanyl. As I put it in my, I've been saying for a while now, the Trump approach to tariffs is that they're both a floor wax and a dessert topping, right? They're just everything for every purpose. There's an all-purpose thing. They're schmoo in economic terms. And I just don't think that proves to you that that helps demonstrate my point, which is that I think he likes tariffs, because I think he sincerely believes they work and that McKinley was right and all that kind of stuff. But that he likes the way it gives him arbitrary power, makes him the center of politics. And it's very much like linguistically conquering the Gulf of Mexico or trying to take Greenland. It's part of his aggrandizement about personal glory more than it is about some particulars about economic policy.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think. Well, I or at least it's both. I mean, I think it is certainly a floor wax and a dessert topping. And that's, I think, part of the problem that investors are having and the businesses are having. I think, again, at his core, the president is a mercantilist, and there's a lot of intuitive appeal to mercantilism. Is the way that countries were managed for centuries. Anybody who's tried to teach students the theory of comparative advantage, knows that it is not intuitive, and it takes some work for people to understand it. It's very natural to say, why are we importing lumber from Canada? We have, the ability to produce lumber here. Why are we buying more from Canada than we're selling to Canada? That doesn't make any sense. There must be something wrong with the relationship. We need to strike a better deal. These are very kind of intuitive things, and I think they're wrong, but they're intuitive. And the president doesn't agree. He thinks that they're right, and he thinks, again, incorrectly, he thinks that tariffs will reduce the trade deficit. And so I think, like, everything else is gravy, right? If the tariffs bring in revenue, and that means we can cut, taxes by more than we otherwise would be able to, that's great. If it doesn't happen, that's fine. The tariffs can be used to try and pursue other strategic ends, like reducing fentanyl flows into the country, reducing the number of illegal immigrants who come into the country. If that doesn't work, that's fine. If it does work, great. Tariffs can, revitalize, reshape the face of the American economy. If that doesn't work out quite as planned, that's fine, because at the end of the day, the president, again, incorrectly but sincerely, I think, believes that these tariffs will reduce the trade deficit, and that is sufficient reason for doing it. And that leads to, obviously, an enormous amount of incoherence, where, depending on which administration official you ask, and depending on which day you ask them, you get a totally different rationale for why the United States is pursuing this strategy. The president's advisors go on TV and say things like, this is a drug war, not a trade war. And, the next question is, okay, well, if it's a drug war, why are you putting these tariffs on EU imports? And, there's not a compelling response to that.
Or you look at the reciprocal tariff stuff, right? So you have the reciprocal tariff, the argument being, which again, Kevin Hassett floated this weekend on one of the Sunday shows, that the goal of the reciprocal tariffs is to, which says we're going to have the same tariffs that you have on us. Intuitively sounds fair, right? So, but he says the goal is to get them to lower their tariffs so that we then lower ours.
Mm-hmm.
But wait a second. We just heard that we're going to make a fortune off of tariffs, and that we're going to get rid of the budget deficit, and we're going to get rid of the income tax.
Yeah.
And they're going to make, as Trump put it in his joint session, they're going to make America rich again, because American consumers don't pay for those taxes. Those are all paid for by foreigners, according to Trump. So why is it a goal of our trade policy to get into a virtuous cycle of everyone lowering their trade barriers, if the whole point of getting rich is by having high trade barriers? I mean, it's incoherent on its most fundamental assertions and assumptions.
Yes, for sure. And that's, kind of by definition, right? If it's, since it's that incoherent, it's impossible for businesses that are trying to navigate this environment to have any idea kind of what to expect, to know what the goals are, to realistically assess where all this is headed.
All right, so I completely understand and agree why looking at bilateral trade deficits makes no sense, right? Because the idea that somehow we're going to have absolute parity in our economic exchanges with Canada, or I don't know, with Switzerland, right? I mean, like the idea, it's just going to happen to work out that they're going to buy the exact same amount of stuff from us that we buy in chocolate and Swiss watches, right? It just makes any sense, right? But we compensated for surpluses with other states and all that kind of thing, and so it's like, to use your analogy, of course you're going to have a trade deficit with your supermarket, but I might not with my publisher because I send them a manuscript, right? And then they send me money, or at least I vaguely recall that happening in the past. And so I get that entirely. What is your response to the point about, okay, even when you average, when you tally up all these different countries and you just look at our bottom line global trade number, what is your response to the claims that running a significant trade deficit is a really bad thing and deleterious to long-term economic health?
Yeah, I think that kind of misunderstands what's driving the trade deficit. And so, at the end of the day, I think, a helpful way to think about this is that the US produces a certain amount of stuff every year, and the US consumes a certain amount of stuff every year. So American businesses are making stuff, American households and American businesses are consuming stuff. And if we're consuming more than we're producing, then we have to be importing.
Mm-hmm.
The stuff that we're consuming has to come from outside the United States, because by definition we're consuming more than we're producing, and so the consumption that we're enjoying above our production has to come from outside the United States. And that is kind of a good thing. We're consuming more stuff, and in exchange we're writing IOUs to other nations. They're getting little pieces of paper, and we're getting automobiles and clothing and all sorts of stuff that we want to be consuming. I think you can make some nuanced arguments here. And so, during an economic downturn, for example, where we have a bunch of unemployed people, maybe we should be a little more concerned about trade deficits, because if we have workers who want to work but can't find jobs, maybe like it would be better for them to be making some of the stuff we're consuming, and better not to be buying it from abroad. That argument kind of assumes a flexibility on the part of workers that may not be totally realistic, but I can at least empathize with that point of view. Kind of fundamentally, the trade deficit is driven by savings and investment imbalances, and if the U.S. is running a trade deficit, that means that our public and private savings is below our investment. Maybe like that's something to keep an eye on if we're under saving, in a sense. I'm not super concerned about that, because capital markets are global, and the United States is able to access the capital that we need, both from domestic savings and global savings. But I can imagine a world where we might be concerned about the trade deficit from that perspective. There's debate about the role of public sector imbalances in driving the trade deficit. So, a lot of economists believe that big budget deficits drive the trade deficit. That may imply that large trade deficits reflect an unhealthy fiscal position for the public sector, and that could be a reason to be concerned about them. But I think kind of broadly speaking, those are all hypothetical would be, I think, too strong, but not particularly compelling reasons to be concerned about the trade deficit. And if I'm trying to assess, how's the economy doing? Are we in good shape? Is the macroeconomy healthy? Is the macroeconomy on a good trajectory? There are all sorts of indicators you want to look at to answer that holistic question, and the trade deficit in the top 20. And it's just not a very good indicator of economic health. It's not a good indicator of policy success.
So, I mean, here's the thing. Because again, I kind of resent having to care this much about trade policy. It's just
Sure.
like,
Yeah, I do too.
But so if you Google, and on the side, I think Google search has gotten just absolutely abysmal in the last few years, but that's a different issue. If you Google what share of the U.S. GDP is dependent on international trade, the answer you get is about 25%. In 2022, it was like 27%, but it's in that range. Like, isn't the denominator like a hugely important point here? Like, if you're running trade deficits and trade is 100% of your economy, well, that's really, really bad. If you're running trade deficits and it's 25% of your economy, that means, in other words, 75% of your trade is going to America, right? Is with other Americans. If 25% is dependent on international trade. And so when people look at the trade deficit, they look at it like, oh, the country is being hollowed out, when in reality, I mean, 25% ain't nothing, but it's not, it's, they make it sound as if our economy isn't wholly dependent on trade and we're losing out on all this stuff. And it's one of these things. The other one is like, Trump loves to tout foreign investment in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And he always seems to not understand that foreign investment is almost perfectly correlated with trade deficits, because, and I shouldn't say perfectly correlated, but I remember it was Scott Linscomb, I think, first explained this to me. It's sort of like when you take your kids to Chuck E. Cheese
Mm-hmm.
and you forget to use all those stupid Chuck E. Cheese tokens. The only place you can use them is at Chuck E. Cheese. So eventually they have to come back to Chuck E. Cheese, right? So like if we send dollars abroad, those dollars to some extent have to come back. Not all of them, because the dollar is sort of reserve currency and you can play with it abroad. But eventually the place you want to spend those dollars is the place where those dollars, operate the whack-a-mole machine and the skee ball. And that sort of gets left out of a lot of this conversation.
Yeah, I mean, it is an accounting identity, and so it is the case that if the U.S. is running a trade deficit, that means that the U.S. is experiencing capital inflows. Other countries are investing in the United States. That kind of, in an arithmetic sense, that kind of has
sort of seesaw way, right? One side goes up, the other side goes down, kind of way.
Yeah, exactly. And that's that's a good thing. I mean, if your objective is for the U.S. to be running, no trade deficit, or if your objective is for the U.S. to be running a trade surplus, then you kind of by definition are arguing that that we don't want foreign investment in the United States, and that's, I think, a wrong-headed view. Foreign investment in the United States makes our businesses more competitive. It makes workers more productive. It increases the wages of workers, increases household income. This is something that we should want. One of the kind of craziest things that's happened in the last few years on the kind of international economics front was when Nippon Steel, the Japanese steel maker, wanted to acquire U.S. steel, and President Trump was opposed. President Biden blocked the deal. There was this bipartisan agreement. The U.S. steel workers were like, hey, we'd really like this to happen because Nippon is going to inject all this technical knowledge about how to make steel into our company. They know how to do it in ways better than we know how to do it. They're gonna pump a bunch of money into U.S. steel. that's gonna make U.S. steel more competitive. It's gonna be better for us. Um, but these sorts of nationalist concerns and I think domestic political concerns also, got in the way of that. Uh, the trade information that you're describing also includes the second point. Um, you're right to argue that the U.S. is not a particularly open economy, um, but I think the numbers you're referring to also include exports.
Yeah. I'm
And
sorry, imports and exports, right? I mean,
yeah,
it's
and
dependent on international trade is the point I was making, right?
yeah, exactly. But that's an important point that gets lost in the current trade debate. I mean, uh, we talk about the tariffs that the Trump administration is going to apply to other nations, but what we really should be talking about is the kind of tit for tat trade war that the administration is starting. Because when the U.S. increases tariffs on imports from abroad, the countries that we're tariffing are going to put tariffs on our exports. And we saw this in the first Trump administration, where our agriculture sector just got hammered because of retaliatory tariffs against U.S. agriculture exporters. And that uh, got to the point where President Trump had to bail out a bunch of farmers in order to make them whole for the damage that he was doing to them, that that by subjecting them to these retaliatory tariffs. And so, trade is a two-way street. Kind of third point on the trade as a two-way street point, you're totally right that a lot of the discussion about trade argues that trade is hollowing out middle class opportunities. And I think this conversation is just that kind of conventional view, that narrative is just completely uh, confused. If you look at the kind of most prominently cited studies of jobs lost due to import competition with China. So U.S. manufacturers have to compete with Chinese imports, lost a bunch of jobs. You see that the U.S. may have lost 2 million jobs, maybe a little bit more than that over a 10 or 15 year period. And so call it 200,000 jobs a year, 250,000 jobs a year lost over that 10 or 15 year period, something like that. Every month, 5 million jobs are lost in the U.S. economy. So, 250,000 a year versus 5 million a month. The U.S. has a big, dynamic labor market. People are constantly leaving jobs. People are constantly getting new jobs. And so, yes, there were some jobs lost due to import competition with China, but it is nothing in the scope of how many workers separate from their employers on a
But
monthly basis.
as you full well know, because you give talks about this stuff all the time, the response to that is, yeah, but what are the quality of the jobs being replaced versus being lost?
Well, on average, they're higher. I mean, again, service sector jobs now pay more than manufacturing jobs in the United States. But even that, leaves out half the story, because the research that's being used in these political debates only looks at jobs lost due to import competition. It doesn't look at jobs gained due to exports. And
Mm-hmm.
over the same period of time that the U.S. was opening itself up to imports from China, the U.S. was also opening itself up to exports to China,
Mm-hmm.
and to exports to the rest of the world. And so, there was an economist a few years ago who went back and said, okay, well, let's, kind of, redo what these studies did, focusing on import competition, but let's also include the jobs that were gained due to exports. And it's basically a wash. On
Mm-hmm.
net, the U.S. didn't actually lose any jobs due to trade during this period.
Right.
Lost some jobs due to imports, gained some jobs due to exports, and that's I think again kind of connected to the broader policy debate right now. we have a globally integrated economy. And when you put tariffs on all this stuff, you're raising the costs to businesses that have to import stuff from abroad to make things here. And so it's just, it's just a very confused conversation.
All right. So in the time we have left, I want to move on from trade related things, which I probably dwelled on too much, but I kind of feel like people, it's front of mind for a lot of people right now, and they're trying to figure out what they're supposed to think about all this.
For sure.
But there's some other stuff that people are trying to figure out what they're supposed to think about. And one
The
of
meaning
them,
of life.
no, I leave that to Ramesh. Whatever he tells me the meaning of life is, I go with it. But one of them is, well, there are two of them. One is this idea of creating a sovereign wealth fund,
Yeah.
which I find abysmally stupid, which you can come at. If you disagree, we can argue about it now. That's fine.
Mm-hmm.
But the one I'm more offended by is the crypto reserve.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
So I'm just kind of curious, what do you think of the, I guess we have one now, right? We're just taking the confiscated crypto coins or something and using it, or we're studying it, or we're about to do it. What do you think of the idea?
I mean, I think it's a very bad idea. I think a sovereign wealth fund is a bad idea, and it seems to me to be like an offense to the spirit of our constitutional structure of government, right? This idea that we would have this kind of fund that generates revenue that the president can spend, that isn't congressionally appropriated. I mean, it may be, I'm not a constitutional lawyer. It may be perfectly legal by the letter of the law, but it seems to me to be an offense to the kind of spirit of the law. It also is just obviously such an invitation to cronyism and to corruption. And we just, we don't need it. I mean, countries that have these sovereign wealth funds are countries that, typically have large
oil surpluses. I mean, that's what like 80% of them are, right?
Yeah.
Norway and Saudi Arabia and these places where they're like, we'll have massive inflation if we try to spend all our profits from oil. So let's create a long-term fund, which makes total sense to me, right? Like,
Sure.
Alaska has the permanent fund. It makes some sense, I get it.
Yeah, no, I agree with that.
But here's the thing I want to get to on the crypto thing, because it's what I truly don't understand. Like, I think it's a source of massive corruption. I think it is just a straight up gift or payment to essentially donors who've bribed Trump, in the sense, and I don't mean bribe like necessarily illegal bribes. I just mean like they've bought and paid for a chunk of policy from the Trump campaign, and this is what they're getting in reserve. And it is a way to take an asset whose value is entirely dependent upon its scarcity, which is probably true of all assets to one extent or another, right? And take it off the market, which makes the crypto that people have in their accounts more valuable. And so the whole idea of a strategic oil reserve is that one day you may need to release not money, but actual oil, right?
Yeah.
Okay, because there's something going on in the world economic system that you cannot buy enough oil in time that you may need it for military reasons or something else. That's the original idea of it. That makes sense to me, right? It's like, I understand that commodities are fungible, but there are moments when you cannot actually funge a commodity.
We have the Strategic Petroleum Reserve here in this country.
Yeah, and that's why you have it, right? You have it for moments where you cannot literally buy or produce oil in time to fit a national emergency. The crypto reserve doesn't fit that definition by any sense, because it's just money, right? It's a form of money. Whether you think it's a great form of money or desirable form of money, the argument people will differ. If we think we need a reserve of money, we should put our money in it, not this other asset, right? But the argument is made, well, we need to be the leader in crypto, and this is a way to show leadership in crypto and all this kind of stuff. And so here's the question I have for you, because I really just don't understand this as a matter of like fundamental policy, and maybe I'm truly not understanding something relevant. I have been told, I have it on good authority, that it is good that the U.S. dollar is the global reserve currency. That is sort of a linchpin of our economic policy, is to have, the most important currency in the world. I've also been told that the point of Bitcoin and some of these other cryptocurrencies is to replace fiat currency or currency dictated by states, politicized currency, and have a global sort of lingua franca or Esperanto of currency, right? Now, why are we investing in something whose goal it is to replace the dollar as the global reserve currency? Why are we so keen on boosting that? I truly, what am I missing?
I don't think you're missing anything. I mean, I think if you caught these guys in a moment of human honesty, they would probably say that, crypto is so far away from actually replacing the US dollar, and the odds of that happening are so low that, like we can help boost the price of crypto to make all these crypto investors a whole lot richer and not actually put at risk any of the real benefits of the role the dollar currently plays.
And so I want to bring us back to where I sort of started, or not started, but what I was getting to, my point before. I think the sovereign wealth fund idea, and I think it's interesting that you immediately go to sort of, Yuval Levin-esque, Adam White constitutional arguments about it. But I think the sovereign wealth fund idea, the crypto fund idea, or reserve idea, tariffs, all of these things are basically, like you point out, that there's something sort of against the spirit of the Constitution to have a president unilaterally spending money. That's the point of all of this stuff, is that it's either actual capital or political capital. It's funny, if you go back, Cato did this really great, Phil Magnus did this great history of tariffs in the 18th and 19th century up to like 1934 and their role in politics for Cato a while back. And one of the reasons why we got the IRS in the first place, why we got the income tax in the first place, was that the tariff system was so conducive of corruption that it basically was undermining the republic, and it was making it impossible to govern, because back then Congress really ran trade policy, and everybody was asking for a carve out or special treatment or robust enforcement against their competitors, every region, every interest, every specific firm. And finally, they're just like, we can't raise money like this because it's so unpredictable and it's so corrupting. So they switched to the income tax. Now that we've outsourced trade policy to the presidency, idiotically to a certain extent, or maybe not idiotically, it just idiotically that we didn't plan that Donald Trump would take it over, because you can make a case that it was pretty well handled for the last 50 years by normal presidents. But that fact, that phenomenon, that dynamic of attracting special pleading, of having CEOs have to get next to you at Mar-a-Lago to ask a favor, right? I mean, like literally a couple days ago, the president of the United States said he is going to suspend tariffs for the auto industry to protect the auto industry from the tariffs that he wants to impose, right? And it is a very monarchical, sort of by my leave, arbitrary power sort of thing that appeals to it. And that's my point, is that all of these things, the foreign policy people want to talk about the foreign policy stuff, and the economics and trade people want to talk about the trade stuff, and the constitutional people want to talk about the constitutional stuff, as if these are all different silos, when in fact they're all unified by the actual psyche and motivations of one guy, and his approach to all of those areas is basically the same.
Yeah, I agree with that for sure. I also think they're unified, in an economic sense. And so you bring up the foreign policy guys, for example. I don't want to introduce a whole new topic here, but a lot of the debate about U.S. assistance to Ukraine seems to like implicitly assume that the U.S. is doing Ukraine a favor, that this is like an act of charity in some sense. Vice President Vance lecturing President Zelensky, why don't you say thank you to the United States? And it seems to me that like the U.S. has a direct economic interest in Ukraine uh, pushing back on Russia. Russia has expansionist territorial ambitions. If Russia is able to take Ukraine, that's going to encourage them to take Baltic countries. It's going to increase instability in Europe. It's going to increase the odds of additional land wars in Europe. And that has a direct effect on the prosperity of the American people. That has a direct effect on the prosperity of the American people. Americans will be poorer if Russia is not contained, and Ukraine is containing Russia, or at least attempting to. And so, we have a direct economic interest in supporting Ukraine. For every $1 of U.S. taxpayer money that is spent supporting Ukraine, we're going to get way more than $1 back. It's a good investment. It's an investment with a positive return. It is not charity. We are not losing money in any sort of holistic sense. And so I think my point is that you're right about the kind of way in which the policy debate is siloed, and I think that's unfortunate because yes, kind of everything is unified by President Trump's belief in himself and in executive power and in the way that he's running the White House and the executive branch. Everything is also unified in an economic sense. There are economic reasons for doing all these things, and that's something that presidents used to always know. I mean, the U.S. rebuilt Europe after World War II with the Marshall Plan. I mean, maybe there's a sense in which that there was a humanitarian component to that for sure, but also that was in our interest to do, and maintaining global security and peace around the globe creates the kind of stability that allows for economic prosperity. And this didn't used to be that hard. Like, presidents and senators and government leaders used to know this, and it's been kind of shocking to see the Trump administration display a profound ignorance of these basic realities.
With that, Michael, thank you for the soft landing to the regression to the mean and quality of AEI guests. I really appreciate it. And
I'm always happy to serve.
And we will have you back when the golden age truly begins.